All right, babies. Uh, Please, I want you to keep in mind, man. These videos are genuinely for me to think out loud. Some of them are a lot more interesting than others. Some of them target things that are just like that make me feel some kind of way, and others are just kind of like nostalgic or some kind of like off-script adventure that I want to recap and kind of like conclude in a beautiful way. Everything is beautiful with me, by the way. So just like please, corniness at its maximum. Here we go. Today's video is long rides and effect of destructuring concepts in my mind and their effect. Long rides and their effect of destructuring concepts in my mind. I think that's the day where I realized that watching things pass me uh, allows my mind to kind of just. So it's funny. Okay, I'm going to describe two scenarios. One where we're kind of driving, but on one side there's a mountain, on the other side there's a valley. And that's the beauty of our country. It's super fucking tiny. But that tininess is very much we have two like mountains that go from north to south of the actual country. So on one side of the mountain we actually have the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and then we have the mountain, and then the same mountain on the other side there's the mountain, and then there's a valley. I would say beautiful landscape. If Lebanon was bigger, we actually have more things to kind of like engage with from a landscape perspective. But when I'm driving down the mountain where I'm only like looking at like mountainous areas, like trees passing by and like rocks and houses, just like kind of all that stuff. It's a different trigger to my mind than when we're driving like on long trips where like it's kind of like the same outlook. Like you see a mountain, but not the details of it because you're kind of like going like super fast and you're not kind of like using those smaller roads. So it's not a main road, it's let's just say highways. So when it comes to highways and you're like there are valleys and you're passing by, I'm able to kind of like just look at one thing and my mind kind of starts exploring in a way that allows me to kind of like notice what it's exploring. But when I'm driving or when I'm riding in a car and there are like a lot of things happening and passing by, there's barely any time for me to notice any of my thoughts. And see that because, well, at least with that, what happens is every single thing that pops up is in different environments, and we're kind of like going through it. And again, different environment as in we're crossing multiple villages, we're crossing multiple types of trees, types of flowers, and all of these are kind of like blasting in my mind because like every single thing around is a trigger. Where like is a trigger to something you're used to or something completely new. And once there's an actual view that you're able to look at, you kind of like are set and focused on the view. So your mind is able to kind of like explore the trigger, which is the view, and anything it presents from it. Anything that you're inputting from the view kind of like says something to your mind. And your mind kind of like gives you the information or connects certain bits and pieces of information around it. That for me, for example, is like a different processing method than if you're traveling through like multiple villages over a course of 1 hour and multiple like different roads and different sides of the mountains. And these kind of things are amazing simply because, like, you know, at some time you're going to see trees, and sometimes you're going to see just rocks, and sometimes you're going to see sun, and sometimes you're going to see houses, and then sometimes you're going to see houses with like certain style shops. And like every village has its own unique approach. Sometimes you're going to see churches, sometimes you're going to see mosques. And there's a beauty in that, but like each one of them is its own kind of like trigger. So the processing factor in my mind is kind of like trying to build a different image with every different scenery. And I've discussed it once before. It's because with every environment, what happens within the environment kind of creates like a certain like thoughts, or let's just say ideas, thoughts, or concepts that you kind of engage with. And if you that's the feeling when you go from one room to another and you forget what you wanted to do. It's simply because it's a different environment. So whatever it is that was on your mind was placed on a shelf, and the minute you enter a different environment, it's thrown out. That's why when you go back to the same room, you get to remember what you were thinking about before you left or what you wanted to do. So if you imagine it that way, you actually could understand that when you're traveling through multiple villages, what you're getting is different thoughts, different ideas. And you, as an interactive character in this kind of like transaction, not the one on the road that's driving, and not the thoughts, because those are your mind, but you as an I, observing these kind of like thoughts changing and shifting because of how consistent, because of how many of them exist. What it allows is it kind of like it allows me to kind of like note, it's not notice, engage with the depth of these triggers, or at the very least, the relevance of these thoughts to me. And it's one of those, like, if you, it was a research done by the book Thinking Fast and Slow, and people were given a decision. Basically, they had to make a painting, they had to make a couple of paintings, and they had to basically choose over, I think, like, they choose within like 20 minutes to an hour which painting they have to give away. And others were given the same task, but they had to choose within 3 days which painting to give away. And the people that were given 3 days to kind of like make a choice between what to give away agonized for 3 days over the decision they could make. And once they made the decision, they were very much not hesitant, but there was always those like seeds of doubt slash regrets, like did I make the wrong choice or whatever it is. And if we apply the same thing here, again, like all of this is coming out because I'm talking about it, then ultimately, because I'm going through a whole lot of different scenery, the environment's changing, and it's allowing me to kind of like notice how deep these thoughts are and how relevant they are to me based on those triggers, and what are the things that actually like connect with me. And I go like, huh, and then I think about it for 2, 3 minutes before the environment kind of like, before I go back to the external environment that we're passing through. Remember, that's a lot of visual stimulation, just all sorts of things changing. Well, in the previous example, there's just like one kind of like setup, like a whole lot, a field, and I get to choose what to look at in the field. So you're kind of like passing and looking out the window, doing like this, instead of just kind of going like ooh all over the place. So like the video's title is Long Rides and the Effect of Destructuring Concepts in My Mind. I don't necessarily think I am destructuring anything naturally because I don't really think. Like, my mind does the thinking for me. And that's a blessing that we're given. And sometimes we kind of like force ourselves in it, but we're incompetent. So what happens is with all these kind of like environments, while you're driving, while you're walking, all these kinds of things, ultimately you get to actually perceive your connection to these thoughts. And because they're happening at a rapid pace, because you're driving, then ultimately they're creating that sentimental existence and they're showing you their sentimental existence. I'm talking about thoughts, the things you think about randomly as you kind of pass through things. And even when you're in a certain kind of mood, right? Because moods, the triggers, actually, depending on the mood that you're operating with, are affected differently. So it kind of draws out the things that actually are important enough for you to consider differently and empties your mind of the things that are not really like there. Don't get me wrong, man. Everything is stored in memory. You can remember shit that is complete nonsense for no fucking reason other than the fact that something triggered it. Whether you see a friend of yours and you remember this one time that you never really considered a while back, or whether you're eating something that reminded you of a flavor, or whether you kind of like somebody said something that made you feel a certain kind of way, and then all the times you felt that way basically start like piling up behind each other. Like everything is stored in memory. It's fascinating. But the relevance, the one that you actually like need to be connected to, Sometimes we kind of like over input throughout the days and we don't really like let them out. And so there's a cluster in our head that's kind of like filled with all randomness. And I say randomness is because until you realize they're not that important, they're going to be there and you're going to be seeing them every once in a while. And ultimately, what happens is basically as you're driving, and especially when scenery is consistently changing, the things that are coming up, if they're actually important, they kind of stick around for a bit longer. And by the end of the ride, you kind of like have like a couple of thoughts that are still there if you actually choose to look at what your mind kind of like ended up from the process. But if you're looking throughout the drive, and if you're actually noticing throughout all these changes, the different thoughts that come, you actually create that connection as well with how irrelevant they are, so that in the future, and the minute you see them, the minute they're triggered, the minute that kind of thought comes up, if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. And I think that's a strong point because human beings tend to want to establish things for themselves. And I really want to end with this example. Like if somebody told you like coffee is hot, you still taste it to see how hot. And it's the same with basically our kind of like our the processes of our mind, our thoughts, our interactions with anything. We kind of want that like first-hand experience. And even though just having a long ride and just enjoying the view would literally clear a whole lot of things from your head simply because things are coming and going and only the relevant part starts, you creating a relationship with that drive allows you to notice every single thing that came up and build that relationship with these things in order for you to understand how to utilize these things that are always at the forefront of your mind and how relevant they would be regarding the situations that they're kind of like involved in. Remember, it's an emotional thing. And that's it. Destructuring the concepts of my mind through driving. It's a video.